fact, I got the quote right here. It says that the Trump administration's policy, their hope is that the cartels will, quote, step back away from fentanyl and they'll just go back to what they've always done, which is cocaine and methamphetamines and a little bit of heroin. If that's the goal, that's achievable. And that will end up saving 80 to 90,000 Americans' lives every year, because what that goal actually represents is a return to the status quo ante 2015. And so what you see Mr. Trump doing is he is altering the incentive landscape. He's not targeting the cartels. He's targeting the Mexican government. And he's doing it through a credible threat of using tariffs as leverage to align their incentives with ours. And one of the manifestations we've seen in that is the handing over of these 29 cartel men. Now, what's significant about this is Mr. Trump's policy has obviated what's called the protection market in Mexico. The protection market was created in 2007, and it is what allows for the cartels to operate. And so the judges that have been gumming up the extraditions for 10, 11, 15 years, what they're doing is because they were paid. Well, what Ms. Sheinbaum did in response to Mr. Trump's credible threats is she invoked the national security law and handed these men over. They weren't extradited in accordance with the treaty. They were expelled out of the country. That's why a man like Caro Quintero, he's facing capital charges. A Mexican national would never face capital charges if he was extradited according to the treaty. And so this is an entirely new element that I'm sure has shaken the cartel leadership to its core, because their first and second and third line of defense is always corrupt Mexican political figures. Well, if Ms. Sheinbaum is prepared to forego the extradition process and just start handing over people, like two of the guys she handed over were guys that got arrested in the last 3 weeks. They hadn't even been to court. She's just kicking people out of the country. That changes the entire landscape, because now the cartel leadership know their protection could be rendered moot. So you've got a two-pronged attack from Mr. Trump. One, they're threatening the Mexican government with leverage, utilizing trade tariffs. On the other hand, the Foreign Terrorist Organization designation, that's not targeting the cartels. They're already all looking at life sentences. That's targeting the Mexican political figures. These are responsible, respectable people in their communities. High-level government officials, high-level military officials, high-level police officers, the law enforcement community. Well, if the American government charges those people, Mexico can't not turn them over. Like they have a lot to lose. Mencho's already looking at 4 life sentences. If you add a 5th life sentence to it, it doesn't change his calculation. But the Mexican political class can't afford to be labeled as a terrorist, or the government can't be labeled as harboring terrorists. So on the public view, Trump is overtly threatening them. And keep in mind, for the first time just last month, Trump's administration publicly claimed that there's an intolerable alliance between the Mexican government and the cartels. That's 100% correct. This has been the case in the last 35 years of the modern cartel structure. But for the first time, it's been publicly stated. And so now the Mexican government is on its heels doing whatever they can to get out from underneath this tariff threat, including expelling people whom normally they would have never sent. You see the number of they've dismantled hundreds of small mom and pop labs in Sinaloa. Enormous seizures in country, not at the border, but in country.
Yep.
And so you see a concerted effort where they're trying to pad the numbers to make their pitch. And so Mr. Trump is essentially boxing the Mexican government into a position where they're going to go to the cartels and say, hey, stop the fentanyl, go back to where we were in 2015, and we can all keep making our money. Otherwise, the tariffs pose an existential threat to the Mexican economy. And so long as Mexico was treating the cartel issue as a law enforcement issue, the protection market could operate. Once you threaten their economy, the feeding off of the cartels becomes a secondary concern. At this point, they got to save the economy, which means Mr. Trump is maneuvering the Mexican government into essentially aligning the incentives from the cartels to us. And so it's a brilliant strategy, actually. And
Go
I'm
ahead.
sorry.
No, I enjoy hearing your thoughts on that. Of those 29, is there any significant ones that you were surprised with?
Look, of course, the one that gets all the attention is Caro Quintero, simply because he was responsible for unaliving the DEA agent. And so obviously from a DEA perspective, from an American Department of Justice perspective, that's an enormous victory.
It's a big win.
That's a huge win. From an operational perspective, look, he had a very small organization. They were operating south of New Mexico, south of Arizona. Like operationally, look, 70-year-old men aren't coming in and taking over.
Mm-hmm.
And so, it's an enormous victory for the purposes of the Camarena family, and I'm sure for the broader law enforcement community. Operationally, I don't really see it happening at much impact. The former leader of the Juarez cartel, Vicente Carrillo. I mean, look, 20 years ago, the guy was a monster, huge. Again, significant in the sense that he's being held accountable for conduct that happened 20 years ago. The two guys from the Zetas, the one of the leadership structure of the Northeast cartel, one of the groups that have been designated an organization by Mr. Trump. Look, Trevinos were massive 15 years ago. And so it's essentially a list of individuals that were in Mexican prisons that the American government has been interested in getting their hands on. So the impact on the day-to-day operations is actually the fact that their protection broke down. And once the cartel leaders on the street realize that the protection market is not going to function, now they have to change their behavior. Because you got to get out from underneath this pressure. Well, the easy decision is get rid of the Feni. Yeah. See, the protection market came into existence in 2007 when Mexico declared war on the cartels, and the American Calderon came to the United States and said, hey, we need help. They said, fine, we'll help you, but you have to implement the same decapitation strike model that was being used in Iraq. Now they changed the name to kingpin strategy. And so in 2007, the kingpin strategy was implemented. Well, that prompted the cartels. See, it would have worked had the counterparty been Switzerland or Norway or a Western European country. In Mexico, it didn't work, however, because there are elements of the Mexican government that are corrupt. Well, they now were able to monetize their influence. So it created a protection market where the bribes became exorbitant. They're no longer are you paying $500,000 for a cop to look, for the police chief to look the other way. You're talking now $50 million bribes with Genaro Luna, $60 million with Cienfuegos, $30 million with Ramirez. And so literally there's $450 million worth of bribes for a dozen guys in that administration.